Self-understanding is hard because people are both observer and subject. One ordinary why people struggle to understand themselves version is that someone tries to judge their own jealousy while already feeling jealous. Emotion changes the view from the inside. The mind cannot always study itself cleanly in the middle of a reaction. The pattern in why people struggle to understand themselves is easier to handle when the first signal is noticed instead of dismissed. A careful response starts by noticing how someone tries to judge their own jealousy while already feeling jealous. Connects to the mind cannot always study itself cleanly in the middle of a reaction. Motives often mix together. Consider the moment when a person says they want success but also wants approval, safety, and revenge. Human choices rarely come from one clean reason. Simple explanations may hide competing needs. The answer in why people struggle to understand themselves is usually found in the cause, not in the label people attach afterward. That is the point where why people struggle to understand themselves becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. People protect their self-image. Why people struggle to understand themselves becomes clearer when someone describes a selfish act as being practical. The mind edits stories to preserve dignity. Self-knowledge threatens comfort when it reveals a less flattering motive. Once the cause is named in why people struggle to understand themselves, the response can fit the situation more closely. The safer move in why people struggle to understand themselves is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Old experiences shape current reactions. In why people struggle to understand themselves, notice when a small criticism at work may feel like childhood humiliation. The present moment carries emotional history. People misread themselves when they ignore the older wound. The link between those pieces is what makes why people struggle to understand themselves useful in real life. In this situation, people misread themselves when they ignore the older wound is the part that usually creates the real consequence. Language limits awareness. A familiar why people struggle to understand themselves example is when someone only knows they feel bad, not whether it is grief, shame, envy, or fear. Unnamed emotions are harder to understand. Better emotional vocabulary creates better self-reading. People often feel pressure around why people struggle to understand themselves before they can explain where it came from. A careful response starts by noticing how someone only knows they feel bad, not whether it is grief, shame, envy, or fear. Connects to better emotional vocabulary creates better self-reading. Social roles can cover the private self. In why people struggle to understand themselves, the real-world version may be that a responsible oldest child may not know what they want beyond being dependable. Roles reward certain traits and suppress others. People confuse who they had to be with who they are. This is the detail that changes what to check next in why people struggle to understand themselves. That is the point where why people struggle to understand themselves becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Desire can be borrowed. It shows up in small moments, such as when a student wants a prestigious career because everyone around them admires it. Other people's approval can enter the mind as personal ambition. The difference becomes visible only when the applause disappears. Noticing that driver early can keep why people struggle to understand themselves from becoming harder to manage. The safer move in why people struggle to understand themselves is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Habits run ahead of insight. Look at a case where someone checks their phone whenever discomfort appears. Automatic behavior begins before conscious explanation. People may invent reasons after the action already happened. The headline alone does not show the whole chain behind why people struggle to understand themselves. In this situation, people may invent reasons after the action already happened is the part that usually creates the real consequence. Contradiction is normal. A concrete version is when a person may want independence and also want care. Opposite needs can exist at the same time. Self-understanding requires holding tension instead of forcing one side to vanish. The background force should guide the next decision in why people struggle to understand themselves more than the first reaction. A careful response starts by noticing how a person may want independence and also want care. Connects to self-understanding requires holding tension instead of forcing one side to vanish. Memory is not a perfect record. In a normal day, someone remembers a breakup in a way that protects them from guilt. Memory organizes events around meaning and emotion. The past can be sincere and still incomplete. In Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves, the clearer reading follows the cause instead of stopping at the visible result. That is the point where why people struggle to understand themselves becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Feedback is hard to receive. Picture the situation where a friend says you become defensive, and the first reaction is to deny it. Outside information threatens the private story. Self-knowledge grows when feedback is tested rather than instantly rejected. The moment becomes easier to handle when the moving part is named clearly in Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves. The safer move in Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. People confuse explanation with excuse. The clearest version is when understanding why they act a certain way may feel like letting themselves off the hook. Fear of excuse can block honest reflection. Responsibility becomes stronger when motives are clear. That mechanism explains why the topic affects real choices in Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves. In this situation, responsibility becomes stronger when motives are clear as the part that usually creates the real consequence. Shame makes the self blurry. In Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves, someone may notice that someone avoids looking at envy because it feels ugly. Shame pushes information out of awareness. Gentle honesty sees more than harsh self-attack. Seeing the cause early gives people more room to respond well in Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves. A careful response starts by noticing how someone avoids looking at envy because it feels ugly. Connects to gentle honesty sees more than harsh self-attack. Stress changes the inner picture. Watch what happens when a calm person may value patience but become controlling under pressure. The self has different states, not one fixed setting. Knowing triggers is part of knowing character. In Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves, the visible event can distract from the driver that needs attention. That is the point where Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Comparison distorts self-knowledge. Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves becomes concrete when someone thinks they're lazy because a friend is unusually driven. Identity becomes measured against the wrong reference point. Personal patterns need context, not constant ranking. When Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves appears in real life, this is the detail to check first. The safer move in Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Journaling can reveal patterns. For example, repeated notes about the same conflict show what memory alone misses. Writing slows down the explanation process. Patterns become visible when they are collected over time. In Why People Struggle to Understand Themselves, this is the point where the visible choice and the real pressure start to meet. In this situation, patterns become visible when they are collected over time as the part that usually creates the real consequence. Actions sometimes reveal more than thoughts. In real life, a person claims they want change but repeatedly avoids the first step. Behavior shows what feels threatening, rewarding, or familiar. Self-understanding needs evidence from life, not only intention. That is why People Struggle to Understand Themselves should be read through facts rather than a quick assumption. A careful response starts by noticing how a person claims they want change but repeatedly avoids the first step. Connects to self-understanding needs evidence from life, not only intention. Safe relationships help people see themselves. Think about how a trusted person can point out a pattern without humiliation. Acceptance lowers the need for defensiveness. Honest mirrors are easier to use when they do not attack identity. For why people struggle to understand themselves, the important move is to notice the chain from first signal to final effect. That is the point where why people struggle to understand themselves becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Self-understanding is ongoing. A simple why people struggle to understand themselves case is this. New responsibility, loss, success, or love can reveal new parts of a person. The self is not a single solved puzzle. Growth keeps adding information. That sequence explains why people struggle to understand themselves can grow even when the first moment looks small. The safer move in why people struggle to understand themselves is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. People struggle to understand themselves because the self is layered. Why people struggle to understand themselves appears when memory, fear, desire, habit, identity, and social pressure all speak at once. Clarity comes from patient observation, not one dramatic insight. The goal is to become less mysterious to yourself over time. The early sign matters in why people struggle to understand themselves because it can change cost, trust, timing, or emotional meaning. In this situation, the goal is to become less mysterious to yourself over time is the part that usually creates the real consequence.